The Final Fantasy series began in 1987, but 36 years later, the recent release of Final Fantasy XVI has me wondering whether it's suffering a midlife crisis. Like many long-running series, Final Fantasy has reinvented itself over the decades, from a turn-based RPG to a real-time action game with RPG elements. In 16, it has moved from its dedication to the power of teamwork to the power of the individual, both in storytelling and in gameplay. No longer do you carefully allocate the tasks of each team member, developing their skills over the progress of the game. No, Final Fantasy XVI follows Clive and Clive alone in frenetic, button-bashing, cutscene-laden combat. This massive change in combat is one that's progressed over several iterations of Final Fantasy. But this feels so far from the Final Fantasy of my childhood that I kept wondering whether Final Fantasy XVI is actually a Final Fantasy game. Despite the often independent worlds of the series, Final Fantasy is more than just a name. And it's more than the surface dressing of Moogles, chocobos, and magic crystals. It's the epic battle between good and evil fought by characters we come to love in the hope that they will win against the odds. It's about fighting against ritualistic status quo, whether that's the worship of the icons or power-hungry rulers, or both. But while there are the surface elements of a Final Fantasy game here, this edition rings hollow for two reasons. The first is the darker storyline inspired by Game of Thrones and Elden Ring. This creates a tonal conflict between the optimism of classic Final Fantasy games and the often violent story of Rosaria. How can you have any joy in riding a chocobo after watching people slain before your eyes? Where magical people are slaves, and some of the side quests involve witnessing the deep brutality of what that slavery means. The second reason the game rings hollow is that the forgettable gameplay demands little of the player other than their familiarity with the attack button. And that's a shame, because the Final Fantasy series was once held up as the pinnacle of strategic role-playing games. Who can forget the fingers and toes crossed moments of fighting Yunalesca in Final Fantasy X? My in-depth review will cover the story and its characters, the gameplay and the graphics. The game takes around 40 to 50 hours to complete, and I'm about 20 hours into the game. I feel like I've played enough to form some definitive views on its strengths and weaknesses, although I will revisit this once I finish the game. This is also a spoiler-free review. So what is Final Fantasy XVI about? The game opens in the middle of a conflict between two warring nations in rough terrain. The main hero, Clive, is branded with the Mark of the Bearers, a tattoo which shows a magic user in this medieval-inspired world. Magic is not the boon it appears here. The bearers are bonded into slavery, and the plot of Final Fantasy XVI hinges on the liberation of magic users across the continent. A step up from the bearers are the dominants, the magic users who wield the powers of the 7 icons. If you're familiar with the Final Fantasy world, you'll recognize the familiar faces of Shiva, Odin, Garuda and Bahamut, amongst others. After this brief introduction to the modern world, you're thrown back to Clive's teenage years. He was once a royal of the Rosarian family, tasked with protecting his younger brother and dominant of the Phoenix, Joshua. The relationship between these two brothers is well established in this opening, and so too the harrowing geopolitical consequences of this small kingdom. It takes approximately 6 hours for the game to open up, and the game improves markedly after this point. Until then, you're locked in a fairly linear storyline and combat scenarios, assisting freedom fighter Cid in his quest for magical liberation. Deep-voiced, cigar-smoking Cid really steals the show here, and if you are a Final Fantasy fan, you know Cid has to make an appearance at some point. But here, with the looks of a fantasy-Nate Drake and a roguish personality, it's hard not to be drawn into his quest for freedom. This leads to part of my conflict in reviewing Final Fantasy XVI. It has some of the most likable characters out of all of the recent Final Fantasy games. Clive is a gentle and noble soul dedicated to protecting his brother. He could be written as an overwrought paladin, but he's a softly spoken warrior who commands the respect of those who follow him. Yet he seems out of place in this dark and violent story. Gone are the colourful outfits of previous Final Fantasy games. Here, everyone wears leather and metal. And with this decade-spanning Game of Thrones style story comes the confusion. As a player, you're thrust into a geopolitical war without explanation. There's not one but 4 kingdoms at conflict, yet it's only approximately 12 hours into the game, and I did check when I got to this point, that you're actually given an explanation for this conflict in the form of academic Vivian Ninetails. Her explanations of the conflict over time are excellent, and it's one of the highlights of the game, and they're accompanied by war maps and character charts. But these come so late in the game, you've already been left bewildered for hours. The game could have benefited from a Lord of the Rings style opening, making clear the 4 kingdoms and their motivations to anchor the player in the world, in the land of Rosaria, where the crystals lie. The difficulty too of being the 16th in a series that's always built around the classic elements of Final Fantasy is that the story becomes a mechanical framework for fan service. The story feels contrived to enable the player to wield the power of the icons. You know what's coming because the skill tree shows you how many you're missing. Likewise, if you've played other Final Fantasy games, you know what Gisalt Greens are for, you'll know the symbolism of the moon and the power of the crystals and the importance of a man fighting his own destiny, which makes the plot feel like a predictable device to facilitate these elements. Added to this are the usual RPG fetch quests. Despite Clive being a hardened warrior, he's got a part-time gig as a food delivery driver and fetcher of things. And look, sometimes those fetch quests upgrade your kit or your potion efficacy, so it is worth keeping an eye out for them, especially the ones with a plus symbol. These quests don't necessarily advance Clive's character, although some broaden up the stories of those around him. Hunts for legendary creatures also keep the combat-hungry gamer busy. I mean, who doesn't want to go toe-to-toe with Final Fantasy's most annoying flying eyeball, the Ahriman? There's plenty to do here, but as a narrative designer, I ask myself, what is the purpose of this task? What does this show me about the world and the people in it? Final Fantasy XVI left me wondering as I fought another creature to pick up another rare object that someone had asked for in Clive's hideout. In a stark improvement on Final Fantasy XV, the game has complex female characters like Jill, Clive's erstwhile companion and love interest, and Benedicta, the ruthless wielder of Icon Garuda. But outside these women, female NPCs are often left in gendered roles as healers, merchants, botanists, courtesans, and bar owners. Diversity is not common in this world, with most characters and NPCs white, despite the exoticization of the Dalmekian Republic, with its veiled and turban-wearing anonymous warriors. There is, however, an astonishingly awful array of facial hair among the men. Now, I do want to discuss the gameplay in detail, as it's a huge part of why Final Fantasy XVI struggles to engage the player. At the start of Final Fantasy XVI, you're given a choice between playing on story mode or action mode, and I chose action mode. Story mode gives you additional accessories equipped at the start of play, which make the combat far too easy in those early stages, and you do get access to those accessories regardless of what you pick here. Where most RPGs are highly challenging in the opening levels, these accessories automate combos and defense. All that's left to do is hit the square button. This is no good if you're trying to learn the game systems or combos. While I did try these accessories out, it made the game boring for lack of a challenge. And this is the biggest problem with Final Fantasy XVI. Everything feels too easy. It's low skill, high gloss gameplay. Even without these automatic accessories, hours into Final Fantasy, the gameplay relies on circling through iconic combos, the powerful attacks enabled as you open up the powers of Final Fantasy XVI's deities. With these powers, you could spam Titan Block and become near invincible with the right timing. Your gameplay becomes about killing time between effect cooldowns and avoiding enemy attacks. And if you can do those two things, the game is not challenging at all. Even the conclusion of boss battles are tied up in cinematic clashes rather than skill-based gameplay. All you need to do is hit the right button in a generous window of time, then mash the square button at the right time, or while the lights are flashing and the enemies are clashing. Player agency has been left by the wayside in favor of glossy cutscenes. But all I was left with here is dissatisfaction. I did not earn these wins, nor did they challenge me. The thing is, gamers like a challenge. We talk about the battles hard won with pride. They become rites of passage. We ask, what did you do to defeat this boss? We marvel at the skill of those who win, and we go back to the battle after losing and losing and losing again. A good boss battle is etched in gaming history. But Final Fantasy XVI holds the player's hand. There's no need to slink away to the main menu to walk away from the game after a 5-hour epic session, to take a break in frustration as the controller slips through our fingers in rage. There's no need to strategically hoard potions, waiting until the very last moment to use one. If you die in battle, you're resurrected mid-fight with full potions and high potions. And not even at the start of the boss battle, you're taken to the latest checkpoint, meaning that anyone who wants to conquer this game can, given enough time. I get that not every game is designed to be hard. I appreciate games which provide levels for everyone, from fans of good stories to those looking for a challenge. But Final Fantasy has a legacy of strategic, challenging, and epic gameplay. When everything is easy, the game becomes boring. There's no adrenaline in a battle if you already know you've won. Finally, it's worth talking about Final Fantasy XVI's graphics. On a next-gen console like PS5, we've had releases like Horizon Forbidden West, which have pushed the quality of graphics to a level unseen in video gaming. And while Final Fantasy has a very different visual style, the graphics of this game are such a mixed bag it needs to be discussed. It's expected that there would be a difference in quality between the cinematic cutscenes and general gameplay, but there is such a marked difference here. The cinematics and large-scale battles are often beautifully done. Much of the gameplay revolves around the Mother Crystals, these large crystal formations which power the continent's magic supply. The interiors of these feel similar, although not as complex as Elden Ring's beautiful Academy of Raya Lucaria. Running through the blue ether, fighting battles under a wall of lava are just great examples of where the graphics and Final Fantasy's creativity shine through. But it's not consistent throughout the game. Engaging with NPCs in daytime is often in flat, unappealing lighting, making the characters look as if they've come from a game 5 years ago. Clothes don't interact with the environment, even just a flutter on the wind. There's something uncanny about the way the NPCs' clothing falls, especially on the female characters. It's an issue I had with Final Fantasy XV, and it's frustrating considering how far games have come. I get that an anime-inspired video game is going to have some different level of stylistic choice, but there's a massive difference between what you see in cutscenes and the everyday people of this world. Reviewing a series as legendary as Final Fantasy is always going to come with the baggage of nostalgia. While Final Fantasy XVI is one of the better installments in the franchise in recent years, it left me longing for the drawn-out strategy of older games. With more consistency of the graphical quality and attention to creating purposeful and tightly written quests, Final Fantasy XVI could have reached the echelons of the best games in the series. But in its desire to please the player with flashy lights, easy gameplay and cutscenes, the core values of Final Fantasy got lost along the way. It's a shame too, because the characters here are all heart. I'm Kat Clay, an Australian video game reviewer and writer. If you like this review, want to talk to me about it, hit up those comments below, and do hit that subscribe and bell button. It keeps me going. Thanks so much for watching.